Greetings and welcome to this light edition of an episode of Captain's Yacht, a Star Trek The Next Generation review series done by two inner-city high school teachers. The purpose of these light episodes is to demonstrate more intermediate levels of video editing and videography for students that have the basic understanding of how podcasting works and decide they want to expand on their knowledge. An added purpose of our light episodes is to break Scholar Beta's and my discussions of Star Trek The Next Generation from a 90-minute podcast episode into smaller, more manageable pieces for you, the YouTube audience. So let's beam aboard the Captain's Yacht and see what we're all talking about today.
Welcome to episode 1 of the Captain's Yacht. My name is @ScholarBeta on all social media, and I'm here joined with Captain Kanaka, and we are ready for the first episode where we take on Encounter at Farpoint and The Naked Now. Take it away, Captain. Let's get this discussion going.
Encounter at Farpoint, which we're breaking into two parts. It technically counts as two episodes because Netflix says so. Gotta love Netflix.
If we're going with Netflix, let's go with it. I like it.
Like it. So in terms of history, because my background is an historian, a little bit of backstory here. Around 1986, the brass at Paramount were talking about rebooting Star Trek for the small screen, which is to say television. Much of this information comes from the very well done William Shatner documentary called Chaos in the Bridge. If you've never seen it, highly recommend it. But just some backstory as to how Star Trek The Next Generation came about. Paramount originally wanted to reboot Star Trek. This was in the late 80s when they were talking about making Fox its own channel. 1989 is when the Fox Broadcasting Company came into existence. And originally, Star Trek was supposed to be the flagship on the same level with The Simpsons and Married with Children. Unfortunately, disagreements came into effect, and Fox did not want to pay for all 26 episodes. They only wanted to pay for about half of that. So it basically got cut down into something called first run syndication, in which they made the episodes, they meaning Paramount, and then any network in America could buy those episodes and play them whenever they want. So on the one hand, that caused some problems with ratings a little bit, because it's not in a very defined time slot. On the other hand, it made the logistics of making episodes a lot easier than it used to be. So if you take a look at interviews with Roddenberry talks about having to run episode scripts onto the stage at the last minute because when in the 60s, Star Trek was originally on the air, NBC's timetables were so tight that there were no scripts until literally minutes before the camera rolled, and having this be in first run syndication saved a lot of that. There was a lot of arguments. Roddenberry did not like the fact that they were rebooting Star Trek. He went in and had a fire and brimstone conversation with the executives at Paramount. And then one thing led to another, and somehow Roddenberry said, "I'll help you." And that's how we get Star Trek. Now, the interesting thing about Encounter at Farpoint is the arguments that Roddenberry had with the brass, specifically John Pike, the Paramount president, one of the Paramount executives, about how long the episode was going to be. Roddenberry wanted it to be a 1 hour long episode. John Pike wanted it to be 2 hour. And it got to the point where John Pike said, "If you do not make this a 2 hour script, I will lock you from the Paramount lot and you will never work here again." To which Roddenberry caved. So that's the birth of Next Generation. And this interesting TV movie called Encounter at Farpoint, which is the pilot episode for Next Generation. Now, Scholar Beta, what is a pilot episode? What's it got to do?
Hey, good question. my base, I'm going to keep this pretty basic, try to cut out the jargon, but a pilot's kind of a marketing tool, right? It's a script. It represents an idea that you have for a TV show that you're using to pitch. It needs to establish characters. It needs to establish the settings or some of the most major set pieces. And then it needs to establish the tone that you're going for too. But I think really more than anything, it's the important thing to take away is that it's a marketing tool that you're using to shop around to different studios and see who's going to pick up and who is interested in picking up and running with this series. You definitely don't go in with the first 10 episodes and say, here we go, here's how I see it working. Let's start reading all of these. Nah, it's usually that low budget first script that gets passed around, and that is what is developed into the series that we know today. Anything else I'm missing from that, super basic explanation of a pilot that you want to add?
A couple of things just to add for purposes of history. Star Trek, the original series, usually what happens when a studio shuts down or turns down a pilot is the show dies. The original series has the reputation in television history of actually having 2 pilots. The Cage originally, and then Where No Man Has Gone Before today. We didn't have that problem with Next Generation. It was an established brand, and the fact that it had that brand recognition basically made picking up the show easy money, so to speak. But yeah, I think posterity would benefit greatly from knowing that little tidbit. So with that in mind, Beta, there have been several different shows, Star Trek shows rather, in the universe. What is your favorite pilot episode?
That is a very good question. I had to think about that for a little bit, and I'm going to kind of cheat and tell you what my least favorite is first, okay? Because I got a very brief story. To be honest, my least favorite, and this is going to hurt my Deep Space Nine friends, and it's a series I love very much, but Emissary is pretty weak. It is tough. I can remember showing that to 3 people I really cared about, and 2 of them falling asleep during it. I love that episode, but it is not a great pilot. There is a lot going on in it. It jumps around in time a lot. It is really ambitious, trying to set up Sisko, what makes him unique, his connection or his role as as kind of an oracle religious figure, despite this being a science fiction television show. Establishing the grief he feels over his wife, creating his... So I know this kind of cheating, but I can tell you, awesome series, did not like that pilot. Just way too much being crammed into that thing to get it going. So, okay, to actually answer your... Okay, go ahead. Yeah, it sounds like you want to jump in.
I've got to say, all your criticisms are legit in terms of the thing that rubs me the most about Deep Space Nine, and it has grown on me in the years since it's been on the air, is the attempt to blend mysticism with science fiction. That's the one part that, as I said, in the years after it's been off the air, it has grown on me. I'm beginning my own little sojourn through Deep Space Nine, and the emissary and mysticism thing is becoming... I'm accepting it more now than I did when Deep Space Nine was on the air. On the flip side, though, my goodness, that intro from Emissary, the Wolf 359, that was spectacular. So, that alone, and Picard, his interactions with Picard post the Battle of Wolf 359 makes Emissary one of my favorite pilots. That said, though, I want to say that your critiques about the thematic stuff are definitely valid. I agree with you on that.
We're gonna talk about how some series carry over to other series, and I didn't even think about how awesome it is that Wolf 359 plays such an important role in that pilot, especially Picard's role piloting that Borg cube or whatever he was doing, whatever Locutus was doing on that cube, and him being technically responsible for the death of Sisko's wife. So yeah, that's a great connection there that doesn't feel like fan service. It feels like they're trying to pull a very important in-universe moment to kick off this new TV show with. Okay, so Okay, so my favorite, I'm going to say what my favorite is, but then I'm going to let you do the talking about it because I think you got more to say about this one. Honestly, my favorite, I'm going to the show that I grew up on, Voyager, and Caretaker is an excellent episode. People going to be arguing, and we'll probably talk about this, about the
Oh yeah.
ending and whether it was right to blow up that
Hmm.
the piece of technology that sucked them so far away from home. But wherever you stand on that feud, it just does a lot of really good things. Um, it establishes the character, it establishes setting, it establishes the tone, it hits all of those. And okay, yeah, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and I'm gonna jump on your discussion because I know this is one that you care a lot about too. So talk us through why do you like Caretaker as a great Star Trek pilot?
You cut out there a little bit, Beta, but with that in mind, it's funny you brought up Caretaker because I put in Caretaker only because I was almost certain, because we've been talking about Deep Space Nine before we started filming this episode, that you were going to pick Emissary. That in mind, I love Caretaker. As a 3-act structure, it's very compelling, which is something that Encounter at Farpoint definitely struggles with. I like the characters. I like the stakes. The ending, in terms of Janeway attempting to do what's right and protecting the Ocampa from the Kazon and stuff like that, I was okay with it at the time. I wish they would have done more with those characters. They attempted to create the Kazon as a stand-in for Los Angeles gangs. But then they said every time they wrote an episode, they came off as discount store Klingons. So I definitely understand the criticism for the resolution of Caretaker. But the characters are great. The premise is set up very well. And unlike other pre-Kurtzman era Trek, it sets up the long-form storytelling very well. That makes it one of my favorite pilots there.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is that point about compelling. The Caretaker moves like a TV movie, and I don't mean that in any pejorative sense. It moves like it was meant to be 90 minutes or longer, than your traditional episode. There's just a lot more going on in there that's interesting. Where I talk about Trek's pilot, I'm sorry, TNG's pilot rather. And you can kind of tell some of that they didn't know what to do with some of the material in their pilot, and the
Oh
compelling
yeah.
factor definitely goes away in the middle of the script. I think it has a great beginning, a great ending. We'll talk about that more, but yeah, compelling is Caretaker. Yeah, it got me into the series. I really like it.
Definitely. Definitely compelling. So this is the part of the episode where we talk about the tropes and we get into some of the deep cuts. So Mr. Beta, which sounds like Mr. Data now that I say it, make it
Nice.
so. What would you say are the premise and tropes?
Okay, so I'm gonna get another kind of cheating. There's two premises going on here. One, the series long one. I'm thinking that the premise for the series is humanity, represented by the crew of the Starship Enterprise D, is being put on trial by a godlike alien to answer for the crime of being a dangerous, savage child race. That's basically what's going to happen for the majority of episodes. And I love it. I think it's such a great premise, and that the Picard and crew do an amazing job admitting humanity's ugliness, and we learn a little bit about where humanity's come from. And the test is a great idea. Honestly, that really does bring the episode together, that they're going to be tested right off the bat. And I love the test. I think the test is worthy of seeing if humanity has come far or not. But then the episode has a very basic premise, honestly. If we just think about the episode and not the series, the episode is basically a mysterious space station on Denab 4 wants to join the Federation. It's to exact specification, but its engineering, its perfection makes it too good to be true. So that is basically, we have a premise for the series, the test of humanity, and we have the premise for the episode, a mystery, basically a space station mystery. So I would just say that if we, one really quick thing, I would classify this under the mystery thriller, subgenre in science fiction. Q's trial is on a clock, as we'll talk about. Otherwise, this hits some of
Yeah.
my favorite sci-fi tropes: giant space creature, living spaceship, God is an alien. It hits a bunch of them that are great. There's a ton of others that we'll talk about with the actual characterization, but those are kind of the big overall ones. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking for the premise and the trope. And honestly, both those are super believable. We'll talk about some premises that are not believable, a la
Oh
Code of
yeah.
Honor. That's, in my opinion, that's
Yep.
not a believable premise at all. But this one hits me. I think it's believable that they would go investigate a mysterious space station and try to figure out how it got built and be really intrigued by that, and then uncover something deeper. So
I love it.
let's talk about where this episode succeeds. Should we get into that now, or
Yeah, we can get into that. So one
yeah?
of the things, if I were to give a Siskel and Ebert level review of this episode, it does the most and the least at the same time. It does the most in terms of building the universe post original series. This technically takes place, depending on how you want to define it, between 80 years to 100 years after the time of Kirk and Spock. And in that sense, it does a very good job of explaining where the Federation is now. It's a good time to be alive. There's a lot of great technology. Technology solves everything. It does a really good job of establishing the history from not only what happened between original series and next gen, but from the events of the audience's perspective to the 24th century. I think that's absolutely spectacular. And there's some very thought-provoking concepts that that develop and unfurl over the course of this episode. With that in mind, where do you think I think you mentioned some of this already, but where do you think it succeeds?
Okay, just thinking about the pilot only, I think and before we get into kind of the deeper cuts here, I think it succeeds in getting the characters in. It has a lot of characters it's got to balance, and some of them are introduced kind of clumsily, but still we understand who they are and what their characterization is. I'll just point out two really quickly. One, Data is introduced. I feel like they understood what they were going to do with Data. They knew he was going to be the fish out of water. He was going to his quest to be more human was going to be somewhat comical. I think they knew what they were going to do with Data. I think they hit Data perfectly in this episode. Crusher, another one of my actually favorite characters. I don't think they quite knew what they wanted to do with Crusher, but still she gets a good introduction. She's doing her science mystery thing, noticing that the cloth is changing color and all that good stuff. And there is definitely some awkwardness with the death of her husband and Picard, and Wesley's talking about how Picard brought his dad's body back to him, and Picard kind of either forgetting about this or just not wanting to talk about it any further. But nonetheless, I think it does a good job bringing the characters in. There's a lot of characters in this show, and I think it does a pretty decent job delivering their basic characterizations. We'll talk more about Worf and Geordi because those are two who are going to get changed quite a bit, and Riker is to some extent, but everyone else I think gets a pretty good introduction. We got to talk about where it fails as a pilot a little bit, even though we're TNG fans. We got to talk a little criticism about that.
Yes, we do. Do you want to take that, Beta, or do you want me to start off?
Why don't you get us started off? I like first couple points you're going to bring up, and then I'll jump onto them.
Okay, so the plot is a nonsensical mess, and that is partially because they have two writers here. And as you pointed out, Scholar Beta, we talked about marketing and how marketing can play a big role in getting an episode picked up. The original version of this script did not have Q, and it did not have the Trial for Humanity. The original script was written by veteran Trek writer, one of my favorite writers in general, Dorothy D.C. Fontana. And she was responsible for establishing all the characters. So many of the things you brought up, Mr. Beta, we are credited rather to D.C. Fontana. But what happened is Roddenberry got in, and either as a consequence of his argument for making the pilot a 2-hour episode instead of a 1-hour, he needed to get in and add his own details. Q and all that sort of stuff, the Trial for Humanity, All those sorts of things seem to me disjointed from the Farpoint episode. Now, you brought up, Mr. Beta, the test, and I think the test makes the whole thing fall into place. Because if you didn't have the test thing, this episode would not work thematically at all, or in a narrative structure that is any sort of recognizable way of storytelling. But Roddenberry has a long history of dirty tricks. Now, I hope I don't offend, because I know a lot of people idolize Gene Roddenberry, but I tend to think of him in the same way I think of George Lucas, where he's responsible for creating a really great idea, and it's through the collaboration process that that idea gets better. A lot of people, and this happens in history too, like to attribute great events to one individual. That's not necessarily the case. And especially with Star Trek. For example, the original series, that theme song technically has lyrics. You will never hear the lyrics actually be sung, but Gene Roddenberry made those lyrics so that he could get 50% of the residuals, 50% of the royalties every time that show is played and every time that song is played. And he kind of did something similar with this story, in which he came in and grafted a subplot which definitely pays off by season 7, and one of the greatest, in my opinion, one of the greatest TV finales ever, All Good Things. But on the surface, it's a dirty trick, because he came in, added some extra things, kind of disjoints the plot for 2 hours, and as a result of that, DC Fontana actually had to take him to arbitration with the Writers Guild of America, and they did a split credit, which means, just like the original soundtrack, the original theme song, Gene Roddenberry gets 50% of the residuals for that episode, and DC Fontana gets the other half. So that's the big thing. The plot is a semi-coherent, semi being the operative word, mesh of two ideas. And most of the action scenes kind of miss the point. The second act main event is rejoining the saucer section to the star drive manually. Wow.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I just think they thought saucer separation was going to be so much cooler than it actually was. I mean, this was going to be the big thing. This Enterprise can split up into 2. But the thing that sucks about that is that the saucer then kind of looks like kind of your typical flying saucer spaceship. But it's not spinning, and it's not really doing anything cool. And then the drive section just kind of looks kind of naked without its saucer. It looks like it's running around without its clothes on, so to speak. It's missing a huge part of it, its iconic design. So you're absolutely right. The manual docking of the saucer to the drive is just not cool. It is not cool at all. There's nothing cool about it. And when I rewatch that scene, Riker basically just sits there and says, -3 degrees to the left, -4 degrees to the right, or something like that. And that's basically the action. Like, that's what we're supposed to be like on the edge of our seats for. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The manual redocking is pretty weak as far as a main action scene goes. The chase with Q is more exciting, in my opinion, way more exciting. So and Q was represented as like a small bubble. So
chase with Q is great, but I wrote in my notes here, the chase with Q is great, and I wrote in my notes, despite the fate of humanity hanging in the balance, there is no narrative thrust.
Yeah.
That
definitely a thematic thrust.
The main action set piece is parking the ship.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
Yeah, I agree with you completely there.
Great deal.
Okay, hey, so we've got some of the base, some of the premises, right? We got some of the bases out of the way. We know where the pilot succeeds and where are some of the shortcomings. But obviously, people aren't listening to for a surface understanding of Star Trek: The Next Generation. People want these deep cuts, so I think it's time to dive in a little bit deeper. I think we already talked a little bit about Roddenberry's trick and stuff like that, but let's talk characters. Let's start talking about, let's dive into the characters a little bit and who gets established, how they get established, what works, what doesn't. Let's start with your first point on Picard, and then, because I kind of want to jump off of that. So what are you thinking about Picard?
one of the things that becomes painfully clear, because I've watched all these episodes before, but then in preparation of this show, I watched them again. It becomes painfully obvious that the writers wanted to make Picard the anti-Kirk. Kirk was an adventurous man, went out, womanized, fought the bad guys. The first two episodes especially, he starts gaining traction and code of honor of things. But the first two episodes are established as him being everything Kirk wasn't. He's reserved. He's really strict. He has no patience. And he seeks surrender over conflict. That's the biggest criticism of Picard I can think about, because we spend so much time developing this great confrontation between the Enterprise D saucer and Q. And it's all built up to be great. You got photon torpedoes, everything's going to be great. And then all Picard does is say, we surrender. And with that in mind, again, he acts, when he meets Riker, he doesn't have a congenial side to him. He does not try to establish any kind of relationship. It's all by the book. It's all very stiff, and it's all very dry. And again, everything Kirk wasn't.
Yeah, so Picard is not going to beat you with a phaser. He's going to beat you with a speech, and that's established from part one, right? He is not going to fight Q. He's not. He's going to do the basic defensive precautions, but he's going to beat you with a speech, with some type of rhetorical challenge or comeback or something of that nature. And I don't know. That's kind of refreshing. I kind of like that. I think they didn't want to lose Kirk, and they definitely took that character and put that into Riker. In fact, when I was looking at Riker data stuff, especially in this first episode, it is so reminiscent of Kirk Spock. You know, running around on the set, you know, firing phasers, getting out of tough situations like in person. That is definitely Riker and Data's role in this pilot. They're the ones who go down to the old Bandy City. They're the ones who survive the orbital bombardment. They're the ones, you know what I'm saying, who go in and get the Groppler, which is a crazy name. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, I can definitely tell they're trying to take Picard, do something very different with the captain, but they still want to preserve that Kirk action young man character. So they got to kind of, and they said they feed that into Riker, I think. But yeah,
that's a really good catch on that.
So that's why I think I'm completely with you on the anti-Kirk, and I think the show would have suffered if there was no kind of Kirk feeling at all. I don't think people would have really recognized that. So I think they definitely tried to give that to Riker. Now that doesn't stick. Riker doesn't stay that way. That definitely becomes like more of Worf's role a little bit later, but yeah. Nonetheless, I think you're absolutely right. I think they had to do that. They really had to say this is a different captain than Kirk. It's not the same one.
Yep, definitely.
What do you think about Q? I like some of your thoughts on Q. Talk a little about Q.
So I attribute a lot of this to first season jitters. The first season of any show typically tends to struggle. I tend to juxtapose Next Generation with another one of my favorite television shows, MASH. And in both cases, the dictums and the storytelling and the characterization is nebulous until the end of the first season, where the actors and everybody tend to figure out what's working and they stick with the formula. Q is very much bipolar. He's a bipolar god. He starts out the first half, the first act of the episode being all fire and brimstone. Speaks in Old English, then talks about containing communism, dangerous savage child race, and then halfway through the part of the scene where he's dressed up like the 21st century soldier in the really strange puffy down jacket that's gray. It gets cold sometimes here in Portland, and I'd love to get that jacket sometimes. That's the first thing I thought of when I watched that episode recently. But you could almost see him channeling, and you can tell Roddenberry had a hand in this, because you can see him channeling Trelane the Squire of Gothos from the original series. John Delancey, whether this is intentional or not, I'm not sure, but the same old story all over again. Because I tend to think in pictures, when John Delancey delivers the line in that specific way, my mind, for some reason, just completely cuts the feed of John Delancey, and Trelane comes up instead. And you can really see that at the end of the episode too, where he completely, or 90%, drops the fire and brimstone act and starts acting like he usually does.
You know, Q is interesting because we talked a little bit about emissary and the mixing of the supernatural. You know, honestly, Q is basically the mixing of the supernatural. They're not going to make Picard like the official emissary to the Q continuum or something like that. You know what I mean? So I don't know. That Q is really interesting. I have to admit, when I first watched the show, I hated Q. Me and my first run through I hated him. But honestly, he's pretty important. Q does not go away and has some incredibly important moments in the series, especially in season 2 with him introducing them to the Borg. And I'm not gonna lie, I prefer to think of him as having a personal obsession with Picard. You know, the more you think about it, and the more you watch those two acting in their scenes together. I mean, Q is obsessed with this one individual. He kind of throws a bone to Riker. We'll talk about that as we get to those episodes a little bit later. You know, Riker wanting to join the Continuum, or him wanting Riker to, or something like that. But for the most part, yeah, I kind of see Q as annoying, but also honestly the instigator of some of the more memorable episodes and plots in this series. Okay, Data.
Definitely.
Can I take Data? Can I start with him?
Data, buddy.
Okay, Data's probably he has to be my second favorite character. And this is not, you tell me if this is apocrypha, but I cannot quote the source that I read this from, but that was originally what Patrick Stewart was auditioning for, wasn't it? Was Mr. Data? Do we know about this?
I'm not sure about that.
Then that's something I definitely gonna go check out, because I remember reading that and thinking, wow, what a good thing they put Picard as captain, you know, or I'm sorry, Patrick Stewart as captain instead of as Mr. Data. I think Brent Spiner does a great job as Data,
yes.
But specifically in Encounter at Farpoint, you know, Data establishes his quirks, his over-explanation, his, you know, not understanding certain human jokes or other types of human interaction. I think that's pretty nice. It's simple, but it's nice. It's that fish out of water character and that comic relief. We have to have that from somewhere. And you know, it kind of came from Bones in the original series, and so it's kind of nice to shift that over to the bridge crew a little bit and get that in the form of Data, because we're going to be seeing a lot of him, and he's going to interact with Patrick Stewart and have great chemistry with him, as well as LeVar Burton and have great chemistry with him. So yeah, Brent Spiner is does a quality job as Data there.
Definitely.
What are you thinking
about Data?
Yeah.
Data and Picard are the two characters I studied a lot as a kid, trying to figure out how to interact with people. The fact that Data speaks a lot to me, and he spoke a lot to me during my childhood, given my neurodivergent condition. I studied Data, and just like with Picard, I have many of Data's famous lines and mannerisms completely memorized and ingrained in my brain into something I call my social matrix, which incorporates all pop culture, but it starts with Star Trek. I absolutely love Data. I love the random tics that he has. I love all the sorts of stuff that he does where he will stop the scene to ask a question. And things that, and I told this to a student recently who interviewed me about science fiction. Data is what science fiction is supposed to be, because it examines parts of the human condition that many people take for granted or don't examine. The concept of a joke, the concept of relationships, that plays a role in later episodes where Data, from a strictly empirical standpoint and logical and rational standpoint, can't understand the finer points of relationships, of love, of this and that. And I think, as you pointed out, the fish out of water computerized portion of him gets him off to a good start. And as I said, Picard and Data, I studied those people meticulously to help develop the vocabulary in terms of behavior and communication. It's great. Actually, one of my childhood nicknames growing up was Data as a result of
Nice.
that. So yeah, I love Data.
I wrote down that he studied probability mechanics and exobiology. Just
Yes.
I don't know why I wrote that down, but I decided that was really important. And then he has that line when they're on the holodeck that prejudice is very human.
Mm.
And I think we're going to find that prejudice runs beyond just the human species. There's a lot of beings in this galaxy who got some serious prejudice. So Data kind of misses that a little bit, but it's okay. He'll figure that out as he gains a little bit more experience. I'm just trying to think. I just really quickly, very minor. In this, the helm is on the right side. If we're facing the captain's chair and
Right.
Data is flying the ship, I guess. So we've got a fully computerized Enterprise, and then we got a computer flying the ship as well. Yeah,
That's a good catch.
I'm gonna just make a note that they kind of struggle to find a pilot in this series. Like someone who full time is going to fly the ship. They never really land on it, to be perfectly honest. And we'll talk about those in future episodes, but I just thought it was amusing that Data was flying the ship for a little while. Okay, let's talk about Tasha. It's kind of one of our last characters really established in this. Of course, I'd love to talk about Michael Dorn and LeVar Burton, but they honestly don't get a ton of play right now. They will
not in
in future episodes, and we'll definitely talk about them. Well, let's talk about Denise Crosby and Tasha Yar. I want you to start with this one. What do you think? I like your note about intense. What do you think?
She is intense. She is, I don't want to say she overacts, but intense is a more diplomatic attribution of what she does in that first episode. And that gets developed very well in the next couple episodes. Naked Now and Code of Honor, for better or worse, that gets established so that there is precedent and reason for why she has that level of intensity. But I'm always drawn to that scene where the Q entity is chasing the Enterprise, and she kind of goes over the top. Hostile matching speed, hostile exceeding speed. I don't know if she was given those notes or if she decided to come off on that on her own. The, shall we say, strong characterization. She was like, I grew up in a place that allowed things like this, court, and there are people like these who saved me. I have a lot of lines memorized, and so it's very intense. It's very, I think they do a really good job in Naked Now with attempting to balance that character. We're going to talk about Naked Now momentarily, but intense is the word I would use in describing her, whether that's stage direction or her own take on the character.
Yeah, I think just like we talked about briefly with Geordi being a really big part of Roddenberry's, idea of like a blind man flying the starship. I think he was also trying to go for a woman leading your security detail. I think he was trying to like defy our expectations.
Oh yeah.
Of, obviously in our own day and time, defy those expectations, but then to make it crystal clear in the future that it isn't a problem that a blind guy would fly the ship or that a woman would be in charge of security. So honestly, I think they were going for a lot of that, and then they struggled to try to like justify it, because on the one hand you don't need to justify it because that's the whole point of TNG, is that this is a more idealistic utopia vision. But on the other hand, like right in Code of Honor, they run into people who question her immediately and her legitimacy as being the security chief. So I don't know, it's really interesting to me. Between security chief and tactical officer, I don't really care about the security chief role. You know what I'm saying? They always mess up security anyways on the Enterprise. Like, they never get it right. But tactical is very important, and they get that right a lot, and they need to get that right a lot, or else you're gonna be in big trouble. You're not gonna win. Exactly. So, we don't get to see her tactical mind as much of just like her being a bodyguard, and so I think she kind of suffers from that. I like that Denise Crosby comes back, though. I like that
Oh
she
yeah.
comes back. She takes different characters on. I think that's effective too, and that somehow keeps Tasha Yar a little bit alive, and we can kind of see, Denise in a little more, I don't know, I don't know, just a different role where I think they knew a little bit more about what they were doing with those smaller roles that they wrote for her later than they
Hmm.
did with Tasha. I just don't think they knew enough about what they wanted to do with Tasha yet. So I think undeveloped. We got intense, but also kind of like underdeveloped for sure. And we'll talk about, obviously, we know why she's gonna leave the show. I don't know if I need to say why or spoilers yet, but
Well,
we'll talk
we
about
can
that when
save
we get
that for
there.
another time. But yeah,
Yeah.
I am absolutely 100% for all the goals that Gene Roddenberry was going for. I know I kind of trashed him earlier in the episode with some of his dirty tricks, but absolutely 100%. Geordie LaForge flying the ship is a beautiful philosophical concept. Tasha Yar in her position is a wonderful progressive concept. But in terms of, again, first episode, first season jitters, it's kind of intense, her characterization. And I love how they tried to balance that out in the subsequent episodes, specifically the next two, if you count Encounter at Farpoint as one episode.
Okay, so we're gonna kind of close off. Well, we got to talk a little bit about tone, and I want to talk. We
Okay.
want to talk a little bit about that cliffhanger before we transition. But I got to ask you something. I got to ask you
Mm,
this. This is a science question. Maybe we can answer this or not. But this is kind of annoying me. I'm watching this. Okay, so we talked about how saucer separation is kind of the big action part of this.
right.
Well, do you recall that they separate the saucer at warp 9.9, right?
Right.
So my question is, shouldn't that saucer be just cruising through the universe at warp 9.9 and they'd have to go like way past Dead End 4 to go pick it up and bring it back again? How does that thing slow down? Am I totally missing something on the
No, you're not actually. I
warp
wondered
9.9
that
is
too.
really fast,
Well, and I
you
wrote in
know?
my notes, technically, the Enterprise saucer section doesn't have a warp engine,
Yeah, exactly.
so you're technically traveling faster than light, and you need, by definition, warp speed folds the fabric of space-time, which requires a massive amount of gravity or energy, which the Enterprise saucer does not have. So I'm glad you picked up on that. I brought
Yeah.
it up, then realized it might be a bit much, so I cut it. But I agree with you on that. Either objects in motion tend to stay in motion. It goes right past Deneb 4, or
Yeah.
because you're traveling at basically hyperspace, because you don't have the ability to sustain hyperspace, you drop out.
Drop out. Yeah.
And it takes years. It would take 7 years for the saucer to even get to Deneb 4 at that point, generously.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I love that. That's a good, that I'm glad you brought that up, because I was thinking that too.
We got to have some tidbits like that for the people who are coming at us for some of the science. This show is amazing, and it really does pay a lot of attention to science and tries to get as much right as possible. And we can talk about their consultants and stuff like that, but that is a pretty glaring oversight. Even someone like me, I always teach a unit in relativity and faster than light travel, and if it's possible, and blah 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 for my science fiction class. And we read an amazing novel called The Forever War, where time dilation is incredibly important, and it's
right.
it's everything. It's basically the entire book, and they didn't think about it for 1 millisecond in the show. They just said, separate it. We'll all meet back up at Dead End 4. Who cares? And sometimes that's okay. Who
Yes, that
cares?
for purposes of storytelling, because of the pandemic. I should have disclosed this year. Normally in the summer I do public history projects for organizations. This year I because there were no public history projects to be had, I wrote Star Trek fan fiction. I rewrote
Beautiful.
season 1 of Picard. And when I was wrestling with some of those comments, those concepts that you were talking about in terms of scientific logic, there comes a point where you could spend 5 to 10 minutes talking about the scientific plausibility of something, or you can attempt to minimize that a little bit in favor of characterization. And they went with the latter there. But I'm so glad you brought that up, because it gnawed at me a little bit when I watched this. I was like, okay, the Enterprise saucer doesn't have a star drive. So one
And
of
I
two
think
things just happened.
yeah. And I think a note for our future listeners, let's probably try to pick up on some of that stuff. I'm sure they will pick up on it and they'll be able to be like, wait, why didn't you talk about this science phenomenon that doesn't make any sense? Yeah, they'll say that in the comments, I'm sure. But yeah, let's try to catch them if we can. Just see what we notice. Not, full disclaimer, neither of us teach science, but at the same time, I don't think you necessarily need to be a science teacher to recognize warp 9.9 would be kind of crazy in the sausage section.
The fact that you make a paycheck, a legitimate paycheck, teaching science fiction lit makes me extremely jealous. I have to crowbar science fiction into my history lessons. You do it naturally. I love that. So
and we're trying to get more sections of that course. So stay tuned, my friend. Go get that literature endorsement and join me.
It's extremely tempting. Trust me, it's extremely tempting. With that in mind, the tone.
Yeah. Let's talk a little tone.
And then we'll wrap up part one and then run through part two real quick. There's something that happens during the trial that made me think of Star Trek in general.
Yeah.
The greatest thing about classic Star Trek, which is definitely where, if I may be so bold, new Trek, specifically the Kurtzman Trek, struggles, is Star Trek is always a future in which you want to live. It's a utopia. Anything you could ever want, depending on who you ask, money is or is not a thing. You work to improve yourself. Whatever you want to do, you get. But there is always some sort of undertone that I've always found fascinating. Star Trek's thesis is that from the perspective of the audience, things get worse before they get better. Case in point, the original series, it is established that the Third World War happens in 1996 with the eugenics wars in Khan. 30 years after the perspective of the audience in 1966. Well, then, eugenics war didn't happen, so they created a new mythos with Next Generation and the post-atomic horrors. Case in point, we're talking late 1980s, Reagan-era brinksmanship, possible arm race stuff. That definitely plays a role. And then, a little closer to home, Deep Space Nine has its Bell riot scenario where basically our own institutions completely collapse, resulting in massive poverty, massive riots. The only thing they needed was a certain virus to be prophetic. With Deep Space Nine, it's actually shocking to see how close they were to actually calling the future. So with all that in mind, before we started recording, Mr. Beta, we had talked about story structure. And being that your line of work is in storytelling and English language arts, I'm curious to hear your perspective on how they handled that if they were to tell humanity in a 3-act structure.
Yeah, I think they did it. I think it's really interesting the way they did this. And I didn't really pick up on the 3-act structure as much until we started talking about it. But the more we talk about it, the more apparent it seems, right? As you said, Act 3 is definitely Star Trek. It is what we see, what we would want to live in, everything that our technology could possibly lead to, at least all the positive aspects. Yeah, and then we move back to Act 2, and it's really bad. It's the lowest, darkest point for humanity. The post-atomic horror, we joked about the puffy jackets, but basically what's going on there is that those are soldiers who are somehow drug inundated to carry out the orders of their superiors. They have that little pull tab thing that they pull and they put up to their nose and inhale some type of narcotic that makes them more effective killers, or they take it right before they die too. You can see that in the trial scene as well. It's honestly really pretty terrifying, a pretty terrifying vision. And I think it works really nicely with all of them except the exception of the Bell riots, because we don't see it. We get tiny little hints. We know who Khan is, but we don't necessarily have to see the eugenics war. We understand this post-atomic horror and that it was a really bad low point because of how the trial plays out and how it's basically summary judgment and execution. So the Bell rides, we actually get to see a 2-part episode, which is really good and really,
Oh
I
yeah.
think, brave and amazing for Trek. To completely go with like racial identity of Cisco and him needing to use his black racial identity to carry the work of Bell and to make sure history played out in such a way that we would overcome what the Bell riots represent. So minus that tiny 2-part episode actually showing us some of the bad, I really think the middle part works because we don't see too much of it. Because like you said, the tone and the idea of Trek is supposed to be utopia. So we kind of have Act One, our own lives, not perfect, but enjoyable, and as enjoyable as it can be in 2020, maybe more enjoyable in '96. I don't know, honestly. In '96, we didn't know what the Star Wars prequels were going to be yet, so it was really a time worth living.
Well
Anyways,
said.
so we have that mode of our life where things aren't perfect, but we're striving, right, to be that more perfect union. Are we? Anyways, then it gets really ugly. And then, we reach a lot more of our full potential as humans. And I love that. I think that's an amazing structure. And you'd think that'd make a boring story, but it obviously doesn't, because there's so many episodes or moments from the third act that we get where humanity's kind of in this utopia. Just because we have all of our technological needs met does not mean that all conflict has been resolved. And that's basically what the show is about. This isn't just technological determinism where because you have the best technology, it shapes how you are. This is a lot more of humanity still figuring it out just now on the galactic scale instead of the, Earth political scale. Or
Love
even
it.
the country political scale. So yeah, I great observation there about the act structure. Had not thought about that in the great scope of Trek. And honestly, last thing, I know you got something you want to say on this. You're kind of right. The new Trek, if we then add like say a fourth structure or a fourth act where that's Picard or newer Trek, that stuff's pretty ugly.
Yeah.
That stuff is pretty dark. We will save all discussion about Picard for a Picard's that is the show for a Picard Star Trek a podcast. So let's I'm gonna hold my thoughts on Picard
Me
for a
too.
little while. Okay, anything else we need to say about tone? Sorry, one more thing. Really, negotiation. That's the episode's first for the pilot's premise is that we have to go negotiate to figure out how we can get Denab 4 and Farpoint Station into the Federation. I love that establishes the tone, the missions, what the missions are going to be like, not this action adventure stuff, more negotiation, cerebral, insightful. So I think it does a great job establishing tone in the pilot, and Trek in general is very consistent until recently with its tone.
Definitely. With that in mind, really quickly, in the context of what Netflix says, episode 1 technically ends when Q appears and says you have 24 hours. Kind of an interesting cliffhanger because it's obviously at the center of the TV movie, but there's a time jump that happens, which you wouldn't notice unless you were watching them as 2 distinct episodes. I think it's an interesting cliffhanger. But now that we're at the end of the episode analysis, we're going to talk Trek firsts and facts. And this is the time in which, if we want to include things, Trek trivia, where this might pay off for you sometime. I know a little bit from experience on this, but little interesting bits of trivia and something that I like to call episode awards, which we'll get into that in a second. But you pointed this out, Mr. Beta. Deneb 4, the first planet the Enterprise ever visits. I have a funny story about that involving a trivia night. If you folks are interested in that during the introduction of the next episode, I can explain that. It's a very interesting and funny story there. Birth of a catchphrase during that parking scene that we thought was so silly and boring. That's the first utterance. And it was, but it does have something memorable. It's the first time Picard ever says, "Make it so," which becomes basically the catchphrase for the whole show. And episode awards. These are things that we've noticed where we decide to give awards to characters or story beats or something like that. And we curate these based off of whatever theme we want to point out. So I've created an award here, the Spell It Out Award, aka the Painfully Obvious Expository Dialogue for the Benefit of the Audience Award. And if you were to have such an award and give such an award, Mr. Beta, who would that be? Who would get that award?
Well, it has to go to none other than our good friend, an adolescent that could be in our classroom, Wesley
Oh yeah,
Crusher.
yeah,
Hey, well,
definitely.
I actually don't mind Wesley so much now that I've worked with 14, 15-year-olds. Actually, how old is Wesley supposed to be, you think? Is he a freshman
Well,
in high school, or is he even younger, you think?
we could take a look at that.
That's
I would
interesting.
definitely say uh, early to mid adolescence in the context of Farpoint.
Yeah.
I would say, like, if I were to guess, eighth or ninth grade at the beginning, but I'm sure somebody who would like to volunteer will let us know about that
Oh,
in the comments.
they'll hammer us in the comments for sure.
Oh
So,
yeah,
okay,
well,
why don't you explain why don't you explain if it's not too painfully obvious, why are we giving this to Wesley Crusher?
because
Why does he earn
anything
this?
because anything that happens in the episode is repeated again by Wesley just so the audience can catch it. Okay? The biggest example of this is when they're at the store at the Farpoint station, and Dr. Crusher's going through the fabric and says, "This would be great. This would go great with gold. Gold would be great with this." Cuts away, comes back. There's gold. She buys the skein. My mother knits, and I'm sure she's gonna take issue with my terrible lack of terminology there. But she takes the skein or whatever of
The bolt.
fabric.
Isn't that what
Thank
it's
you.
called?
Yeah, I think of the bolt. Thank you. The
Yes,
bolt.
the
You
bolt.
redeemed me, Mr. Beta.
You
Um,
good, you good.
and then they walk away, and Wesley Crusher says, "Mom, that gold wasn't there before." Just so the audience realizes they weren't, for lack of a better term, hallucinating. And then
Yep.
he completely dumps all the purpose and function of the holodeck, not only in this episode but in part two. Yeah, he well deserved. Spell it out.
And he spells out the fabric after we have the super obvious apple scene in Groppler Zoran's office. So it's like, wait a second, how'd those apples get there? I'm not making this up. And Riker, we're even supposed to see this through Riker's point of view and be a little confused. And then we get it again. And then just to make sure, yes. Okay, so I've got two awards. I'm going to give for at the end of part one, and maybe this will make our part two commentary a little quicker. My
Yeah.
awards are going to be salute to matte paintings. That matte painting of Denab 4, I love it. Now I gotta say that Farpoint Station, that's a model, and it's awesome, and I love that it's
Yes.
a model. But that background with those foothills or mountains, the kind of barren-looking ones that then kind of disappear into that pink-orange sky. Oh, I love a good matte painting, and that is a beauty. There's a coffee table book of the complete matte paintings of TOS, but not TNG. Someone needs to put that together badly. Okay, and then
Yes.
Enterprise interiors. I'm just going to give a quick salute to the battle bridge. Again, they thought saucer separation was going to be so cool that maybe they thought we were going to see this a whole bunch, but it's over on stage 9, or it was over on stage 9, the Paramount lot, and they
Oh
ended
yeah.
up using this a whole bunch more for like enemy starship interiors. So what the battle bridge started as would later become, the interior of various starships that Picard faces off against. And I actually tried to do some reading to figure out where that Ready Room, if they ever redressed the Ready Room set from the battle bridge. Still looking for that. So if anyone knows in the comments. And then a shout out to the silly engineering elevator that Picard rides in the first 5 minutes of the show when he's touring the Enterprise. It's a really silly, very slow moving elevator that takes you where a ladder could take you, much slower. But you gotta have it because it's kind of cool. It's silly, but it's kind of cool. So those are my
Definitely.
shout outs for Enterprise interiors and awesome matte paintings.
I love it. Now, this is kind of a cheat because this is technically part two, but just to tie up some of the things that we said for part one, and this might save us time, dear reader and dear viewer or audience. So
Whoever you are.
we could talk about this for an entire afternoon, but real quick, the Riker and Troy thing.
Yeah,
their characterization very much Decker and Ilea from Star Trek: The Motion Picture. who
Yes,
themselves were
definitely.
supposed to be part of the original Star Trek spinoff, Star Trek Phase 2. They
Yep.
brought it back. Very quickly, there's obviously more than they're letting on, and they explore that more in Naked Now between Crusher and Picard.
Yes.
But I was
Yes.
watching the scene where Crusher is on the bridge. And I thought of something, and apparently the internet, some parts of the internet back it up. There is a fan theory that Picard is possibly Wesley Crusher's real father. What's your opinion on that?
Wow. Okay, so from a fan wanting everything to make kind of magical sense in a universe, wouldn't that be great? But honestly, from a literary standpoint, I think it's way more interesting if
Oh
he
yeah.
struggles with Beverly and his relationship with her because he sucks with kids, which I want to talk about in a second because he's not that bad with kids. He really just needs to see a therapist and who is on the ship because he's honestly not the worst person with kids on the Enterprise. I give that to Worf, honestly. But
That's true.
I can kind of have my own internal headcanon about some TNG things, mostly incredibly minor characters that we never see again. I like to imagine what they go off to do and who they end up hanging out with in the future. But as far as Wesley Crusher, being Picard's son, that maybe, I can maybe-ish, but I like it better if it's not. I like it way better if it's Jack's son and Jack died and Picard was responsible for that, and that creates this tension. That's just to me way more interesting on a human level than dun dun dun. It just kind of reeks of Vader, Luke Skywalker stuff, and
Oh yeah.
I love that reveal, but my goodness, so does everyone else, and everyone now wants everyone to be related, and it's just meh.
Fair
You
point.
don't have to be. You don't have to be. You can still have
Defi-
great character interaction without that. So that's
Definitely a
my thought.
fair. No, I love that, and that's something that I like it the other way. But when I watched it, and because of the awkward tension that happens, where he goes, "Oh, is that Wesley?" and then it just awkwardly pans for them. Um, yeah, I just thought I thought I was being original. I wrote in my notes, "Can you say paternity suit?" But
Yeah.
then I looked at something on whatculture.com, and apparently that's a thing. So I figured we should address the thing.
Yeah.
To wrap up, because I think we've said a lot of what needs to be said about the encounter at Farpoint. John Pike, the president of Paramount, or one of the executives, talks about this episode not having an ending. What is your opinion on that, given that between the two of us, you get paid to talk about stories?
Okay, so it actually is really fascinating because before our pre-interview talk, I didn't know this was written by two different people as basically as one episode, and then they added the trial in. And honestly, I like the trial stuff a lot more, just as in terms of like literature, than I like the Farpoint stuff, to be honest. So, anyways, what do I think about the ending? I think I laughed at the ending. I'm not gonna lie. When the little jellyfish hands do, when they come together very slowly and then they intertwine their little jellyfish fingers. I mean, obviously that's the ending. There's no way you can say that's not the ending. The ending is, and they solved the mystery, and the captured jellyfish floated up to its mate, and they lived happily ever after. I don't see how that's not an ending. It's kind of a cliche ending, but it's a great ending when you think about the test. The test was, am I just going to do humanity as normal and fire all my guns at this mysterious floating object that's, bombarding the planet's surface that kind of wants to be a Federation ally? Or do I kind of think this out? Do I slow down, think way more critically about what's happening, what possibly could happen, and treat this like the science mystery that it is? Because it's a science mystery. This is not a action adventure show, even though they wanted it to be with that saucer separation. But yeah, I think from a science mystery point, mystery solved, themes explored and resolved. Especially Q is like, yeah, fire those phasers, shoot at them, right? Blow them up, get rid of them, fire all phasers, shoot all torpedoes, or what. I know Q says something to that extent, and they don't. And I think so. I see resolution there. A lot more resolution than you get in some other episodes where it
That
just is
is
like,
true.
and cut, and now we're all back together again.
That brings up something. There's a all the plot lines. I write in my notes here that there's barely an ending, and that was in my notes. But you sold it that because of your analysis there that you just pointed out. There's more of an ending than I originally thought, because all the dangling plot threads about the Deneb 4 becoming part of the Federation, having a star base there, all those sorts of things, all that is completely resolved in one throwaway log entry by Captain Picard. And in the concept, I give that a pass because of screenwriting. I read something recently, actually it was a video essay by Phil Mento on YouTube, which talks about screenwriting being the battle against the clock. In regular literature, you can be as long and as colorful as you want, but in television and in movies, the clock is your worst enemy. You have between 90 minutes to 3 hours, if you want to get generous, to tell a complete story with complete characters, with complete payoffs and setups. Case in point, one of the episodes that I wrote for my Star Trek Picard rewrite dealt with the crew of the U.S.S. Destiny, which Picard is on as an ambassador, coming across a thing they hadn't seen before. And I wrote that specifically because I wanted to establish all the characters on this show that I created. And I only say this because one of the books I've been writing, a historical book, is on the history of baseball in Oregon. And that book has 55,000 words. My Star Trek fan fiction, that particular episode, because I wanted long and colorful characters, had 46,000 words. So with that, real. You can get away with that in writing regular fiction, not broadcast media. So I'm okay with that. In turn, facts and firsts. I have some facts. The overhead lights in the transporter chamber are the same platform lights for the original series.
Nice.
Riker reveals to Troy that her rank is lieutenant. That does happen when they're evacuating the Bandai planet. Her rank doesn't come up again until later on in the show. And she's actually, in the episode Disaster, is kind of surprised that she has that rank. So
wait, she's a lieutenant, and then she's a lieutenant commander, and then she's a commander?
Something like that. We'll have to take a look at that to be sure. But I thought it was interesting because thematically it makes sense because of the relationship they have that's established. Imzadi, beloved, and then stuff is blowing up around them. Riker says, "Get out of here." She says, "I want to stay." And instead of referring to her as Deanna or Imzadi, he refers to her as her rank.
Yes.
Which is characterization that is expanded more in Naked Now. But that's something that I think definitely needs to be pointed out.
Hey, let's talk about that for one more second. I noticed that I feel like they're trying to set up a couple relationships in this pilot. For some sexual or at least some type of tension, right? I feel like Riker Troy, they're trying to set up. And I feel like they're also trying to set up Picard Crusher. They definitely a lot more in Naked Now and then in Arsenal of Freedom and a couple other episodes too.
Yeah.
But to be honest, it's so interesting is as much as they're kind of shoving that in early, it never pays off, really. You know what I'm saying? Like, it does a little in the films-ish, at least for
Riker and
Troy. But it's so interesting that even though they're hinting at these relationships developing, for the most part, these people stay single, right? Yeah. I mean, Troy dates Worf for a little while in the present timeline, so, that is official. But honestly, I thought Deep Space Nine, talking about that, had a little more interesting human drama and relationships going on in it, Definitely. And I think that's really fascinating that at least they're trying to put some of that in here. Like, there is some obvious romantic feelings, but it is kind of sad that they never really get to work on that. I guess in a possible future timeline, we see Crusher and Picard together, but, in All Good Things.
We do.
But we don't know. Is that the actual future timeline? Is that just one of many? Who can say if that officially panned out or not? So, I just think the relationship bit is really fascinating. You can definitely tell they're sowing the seeds. Yeah. So that honestly kind of goes into your next segment
Big
where
time.
where you say goes nowhere, does nothing. I'm gonna just put that under there because
Yes.
Imzadi, as great as that is, it really doesn't go anywhere, and neither does that tension that Picard and Crusher feel, honestly. So yeah, what else you got for
So
goes
you
nowhere, does
mentioned one of
nothing?
the awards.
Yeah.
So yeah, you just that's a new kind of award. We're making new awards this episode because it's our first. The GNDN. For those of you who may not know, that's the specific code that they wrote on piping on the original Enterprise set. And the joke was goes nowhere, does nothing. So if you see those sorts of things on the Enterprise set or any kind of ship, and you see the letters GNDN, GN/DN, that's what it means. And Mr. Beta, you just christened a new award. Goes nowhere, does nothing. Wesley mentions a low gravity gym. I'm
Yep.
not sure we saw that. The only thing I can think of that even remotely approximates a low gravity gym is where they play Parisi squares.
Oh yeah.
Maybe that's what it is. I don't know.
Good point.
But
Yeah.
I'm sure somebody who's more qualified on that will be the authority on that. Another GN award. Riker and Data clink phaser barrels before taking aim at the alien force field to free Zorn, excuse me.
Yep.
And considering how technical Roddenberry got with his universe towards the end of his life, if you take a look at the novelization for the motion picture, Kirk allegedly has some sort of broadcasting transmitter in his brain that Starfleet can activate whenever they want and basically remote control Kirk.
Oh,
Yeah, that's a thing. So considering
interesting.
how buried in the technical aspects, thank you. But considering how buried how buried Roddenberry gets in the technical aspects of his universe, case in point, one of the writers that was hired, Maury Hurley, who was one of the head writers for Miami Vice before coming over to Next Generation. One of the greatest insults that Roddenberry could think up was, "You don't know the difference between shields and deflectors." So
Got it. Nice.
in Trek world, that's an insult. Everywhere else, it isn't. But considering how and I might be making a mountain out of a molehill here, but considering how very buried in his details towards the end of his long and storied career, that might have set up something. I don't know. Another award that I want to promote is the Facepalm Award, the classic meme Picard Facepalm Award. And this came
Yes.
out rather recently in honor of the Next Generation pilot. Marina Sirtis talked about this because this marked an anniversary year for that, the broadcast of the encounter at Farpoint. And that's what the Facepalm Award is, the most embarrassing addition to the Trek universe. Marina Sirtis recently spoke out about how short her uniform was during the pilot, adding that she had to cross her legs, quote, and this is a quote, cross her legs so no one could see what she, to paraphrase, had for breakfast. I never noticed that at the time, but then I read that article and then I watched the episode, and my God, that uniform is real small. And then you notice that she doesn't wear it again for the next couple episodes. That's strictly, to my knowledge, being that it's been several years since I've seen all of season one. The next couple episodes, she wears a purple gray outfit, but not the galactic cheerleader, as they call it, uniform. But that's a face palm.
Okay, we got to do one more face palm though, and it is during
Okay.
saucer separation. The dude in the command skirt. Okay, you know what I'm talking about, right? They're separating
Yes,
the
I do.
saucer and they're evacuating people to various points in the saucer, or I suppose that's what they're doing. That's where the civilians are going. And it's very brief, and it also happens when they're on Farpoint Station. Just the camera passes by a blonde dude who's wearing a Marina Sirtis style skirt, and it's laughable at first, but honestly, it's kind of cowardice because they never bring it back. I understand what they're
Okay.
trying to do with it, right? They're trying to break those gender roles, but they never do it again. Like that's one where they just weren't confident enough to go forward.
It's late.
Probably not.
It's late 80s. I have to step in as an historian here. It's late 80s America. It's Reagan,
Yes.
it's Bush, and it's moral
Yes.
majority in America. So they threw something out there and had to probably back off because of the political culture of that time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
And yeah,
go ahead.
absolutely. Yeah. I would just say, okay, there's one other thing, one last note. I know this is a little out of order, and we've already talked about this, but I just want to emphasize that I really don't see Picard being that bad with children. You know what I'm saying? Like, I know that they were going to do that to try to, like, make this seemingly infallible man a little more fallible, right? Like, this guy who's so articulate and has such skill with speech and presentation that he can talk his way out of anything. They got to give him, like, some sort of foible or flaw, right? But honestly, he's
Mm-hmm.
pretty good to Wesley. Wesley, what we're going to talk about in the next episode, takes over the ship. And then in the third episode or fourth episode, he's flying the ship. So
Yeah,
Picard's pretty. He says, "Well, don't let me make an ass of myself, with children." But honestly, you're doing pretty good on your own, dude. You're not. I don't. And Will doesn't. Riker never really helps him. At least in the first 6 or 7 episodes that I've been watching for our podcast, I don't see Riker step in and actually help him with children at all. Honestly,
help Picard with children. There you go.
yeah, I don't
I
see that at
wasn't
all.
tracking. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good point. He tends to have that. I don't know. There are a few places that I'd like to point out where he kind of gets short. He is short with Riker on their first meeting.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
when the
He's
alarm
not a nice
goes
guy.
off excuse me, and when the alarm goes off and Wesley says perimeter alert, Picard's disposition changes on a dime and starts yelling at Wesley. So there is something there.
Yeah,
And a lot
definitely.
of people remember that for some reason more than the points that you point out. But I agree. In terms the timeline by which his relationship, Picard's relationship, that is, with Wesley improves is shocking considering the writers are attempting to establish that he's not good with children. I agree with that. That's a good point.
Yeah, and that's the only thing I'm trying to get off. And like we talked about earlier, and this is the pilot. Some of it's gonna stick, some of it's not. And some television series, the pilot is never really referenced again, or
True.
it basically exists on its own, and then the regular season launches, or they reshoot the pilot with new actors and such, or they remake it in order for it to fit in a little bit more with the continuity that they had, or that they started developing in the writing process. So I don't know. I think it's just one of those things that they thought, just like sausage separation, put that under the we're going to pay a lot of attention to this. Oh, no, we're not. This is not really going to come back too much.
This concludes the light version of this episode. On behalf of Scholar Beta, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please stay tuned for deluxe versions of this episode, in which video footage will be interspliced with our commentary to enhance our podcast experience. With all that said, thank you very much for the support. Any feedback you give is appreciated because it helps the kids. And with that said, live long and prosper, e malama pono, and we'll see you next time.